With most folks, I start with their decision to go to law school, but I'm going to take you back if you like.
Okay.
And it seems to me that the jump from the housing projects at Bed-Stuy to Cornell University and an undergraduate program must have been a huge one. Would you talk a bit about that?
I was amazingly lucky. I had a mother who raised my two older brothers and myself as a single mother, but she valued education above all. My mother was 19 when she was a senior in college herself at a black college, Virginia State University, and was pregnant with my oldest brother. And in those days, pregnant students did not remain in school. She left, came to New York City, married my father, who was an intermittent presence in my life. And my mother was always solely focused on the education of her children. So by the time I was 5, she worked also in addition to my father, but they had some very interesting discussions, violent fights about what she would do with her salary. My mother's position was her salary was for her children. So though my brothers and I grew up in the housing projects of Brooklyn, every year we went to an opera. Every year we went to a symphony, a ballet, the Ice Capades. We went to a musical play on Broadway. We went to a drama. My mother felt it was important that we sort of see the fullness of life. At 10 years old, I went to Expo 67 in Canada with my brothers and my mother. My mother never wanted to go to the exhibits, and so my two brothers and I would go. Only later did I realize we didn't have enough money for the 4 of us to get admissions tickets every day. So my mother would get admissions tickets for my oldest brother, who was 15, my middle brother, who was 13, and me, who was 10, and we would get to spend the day at the exhibits, and she would sit in the single Howard Johnson's room we could afford. So I grew up incredibly blessed and incredibly lucky to have a woman like that who valued education. I was a junior in college before I ever read a novel that my mother hadn't already read. And in fact, for most of my college career, when I read courses, when I read Ulysses and didn't understand it, I didn't go to my teaching assistant. I called my mother, and she would pull out her well-worn copy of the book, and she would explain it to me, and then I would go into class and look like I was intelligent. And so I grew up blessed in that way. We didn't have financial means. We struggled in many ways. We went through multiple winters where we didn't have money to pay for heat. But what we did have was this mother whose strong conviction was the way for us out of our circumstance, the way for us for a better life, the way for us to see the world was through education. And so it was always understood that I would go to college. That is common now in most families in America. Back then in the housing projects, it wasn't. In fact, we were probably some of the few of our friends who thought that way from the time we could talk, that it was understood we would go to college. And I was extraordinarily lucky that I was accepted to Cornell.
Now, your brothers preceded you here?
My brothers, no. My oldest brother went to Virginia State University, which is a black college, which both my mother and my father attended. And he had a very mixed experience there. He was an accounting major and ended up being a CPA. But when he came back from his freshman year of college, he said to me, "You're going to go to the Ivy Leagues." I wasn't even really sure what the Ivy Leagues were. I had heard of Harvard, I had heard of Yale, and that was about the extent of my knowledge. And so I had a Regent scholarship. Back in those days, it was a $1,000 Regent scholarship, which to me was a fortune. And so that made me say I want to go to school in New York State. And so I only applied to 5 universities. I applied to NYU, Columbia, Cornell, State University at Binghamton, and Notre Dame because I liked their football team. Wasn't going to play, liked their football team. And I got in, I was fortunate enough to get into all of those schools. And I decided I wanted to come to Cornell. I wanted to get out of New York City. I knew on some level that if I stayed, I would stay with my cohort of friends, and that probably wasn't going to lead me into a good place. And I had never visited Cornell. I had probably seen 5 pictures of it in a pamphlet that I had gotten before I applied. And I came up to Cornell, and literally my very first day, my life opened up in a way that I didn't understand. The beauty of the campus, the friendliness of the people startled me. I was coming from sort of a circumstance in Brooklyn where you didn't talk to strangers. You didn't greet strangers on the street because, you know, it was understood that more than likely it would not meet with a pleasant response back. And I came to Ithaca and people talked to me. They made me feel welcome. I had a very interesting undergraduate career. So I came from impoverished circumstances, Brooklyn, housing projects, largely black neighborhood. Came to Cornell and lived in U-Haul 6. And in U-Haul 6, I had a roommate who was a friend of mine to this very day, Rich Friedman. But that was not accepted among the black students at Cornell at that time. I came to Cornell in 1975, sort of the tail end, very tail end of a very tumultuous period in the history of universities, period, and Cornell in particular. And the black student said to me, you can't have lunch with the white students. You can't do things with the white students. And I didn't understand that, because although I grew up in the housing projects, I was always bussed out to white schools growing up. So I always had this mix of close white friends who were my school buddies, and then my buddies from home that I lived with and played ball with and, you know, hung out with on the weekend. And so in my mind, that was just going to continue at Cornell. I would have some friends who were white, and so I didn't choose to live in the black dorm. And I would have other friends who were African American and others. And it was made very clear to me very early on that that was not going to happen. And so my freshman year undergrad, I was miserable here. I also went to a high school that was pass-fail and didn't understand the kind of work and discipline it would take to do well. So my first semester, I think my grade point average was a C+. So I was teetering on losing the scholarship that I had. I was personally as unhappy as I had ever been in my life. And after that first semester, one sort of critical thing happened that at the time seemed like a disaster. I was playing basketball after classes had ended, but before it was time for me to go home, and I tore the ligaments in my ankle. And so I went home over that Christmas break really confused. I was physically broken. I was emotionally broken. I didn't understand how it would be that I could go somewhere and black people wouldn't talk to me, didn't want to be my friends, why I would have to make the kinds of choices that people were asking me to make. The torn ligaments turned out to be the biggest blessing I ever had, because I literally could not walk for that 5 or 6 week Christmas break. And so what I did was I got my economics textbook for the next semester. I got all the novels that were going to be in my English class the next semester, and I bought my textbook for my history class, and I sat in bed and read them. I described to you my mother was a big reader, always read, so my mother actually encouraged this. And so I literally sat in bed every day, and for 3 hours I would read the economics textbook. For 2 hours I would read a novel. For a couple of hours I would read the history assignments. And I came back to class looking at my educational experience very differently. And I suddenly started to do exceptionally well. It sort of trained me to do something that I did for the rest of my college academic career, which is always read ahead. Always read all the assignments, so that class suddenly didn't turn into the moment when I was first learning the material that the professor was teaching. Class was now a review, hopefully of what I already knew and read and understood. But if I didn't, I could hone in more specifically on what it was I didn't understand, because the whole class wasn't new to me. I was hearing this material. I knew from my own reading I didn't get this piece of it. In class, sometimes that piece would come clear, other times it wouldn't. And so it changed the course of my career. The other thing that really helped me is I got involved in student housing. So my junior year at Cornell, I was a resident advisor. And again, my senior year. And that gave me a place at Cornell. The other sort of interesting stroke of...
Did that break you out of having to choose?
No, what did was, it was very interesting. What broke me out of that was, and I'm sure you'll remember, there was a football player, an African-American by the name of Joe Holland, who was a year ahead of me at Cornell. And my sophomore year, he was in the same dorm I was in. And we, Joe and I and 2 other people, every night at midnight would play hearts for 2 hours. I would study until midnight. I would come back to the dorm and we would play hearts. And people began to suspect that if Joe, who was a big man on campus, was an all-American football player, great student, great athlete, if Joe thought I was okay, then maybe I was okay. The other thing that happened is I took a couple of classes in the Africana Studies Center, and that gave me exposure to students in the classroom who had only heard about me. And literally people would come up to me and say, I heard that you were not a good guy. And it was really based on this notion that I did not want to self-segregate. And so that changed. And then when I went into the dorm system and was a resident advisor, my staff became my family. And I became very close. And so they made my undergraduate academic career, sort of much more comfortable. It still wasn't ever what I wanted it to be or what I anticipated it would be. In many ways, it helped me think through a lot of issues about who I was and how I was going to approach the world and what were going to be sort of the fundamental core principles that I would try to hold on to and what would be the things that I didn't really care about and I would allow other people to move me. And so that was a, sort of a formative experience. I always wanted to go to law school.
So that's where I was going to
go. Oh, sorry.
So when did that idea?
From the time I was a child. My father apparently was a first-year student at Brooklyn Law School when my oldest brother was born, and left law school in order to work to help raise his family. And so I always heard about that. My father was in my life in a very sporadic way, probably until I was 7 or 8. But I had always heard that he wanted to go to law school, so I adopted that dream. I really wanted to be a musician. I was a trumpet player, a classical trumpet player, very snooty, very serious, played in all-city orchestra in New York City. I stopped when I came to Cornell. I stopped when I came to Cornell because they told me at the time that I tried audition for the jazz band and the orchestra and got in, but they said in order to do that, you had to play in the marching band. And I was snooty, and I said, marching band outside in the cold? I'm not going to do that. The irony, I love marching bands. But I literally stopped playing cold. And I said, you know what it is? I'm trying to head down an academic path. So I always wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't understand what it meant. I was very, very, very naive about law school when I came. The students today are much more sophisticated, much more knowledgeable. I was so naive.
They've seen law on TV.
They've seen, well, and I saw sort of the Perry Mason notion, but I didn't understand law school. So literally, I came to law school, I didn't think your grades mattered, because I thought of it more in terms of a trade school. The point was to garner the skills and get out. And so I didn't think grades mattered. I hadn't heard of law review. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know why people cared. When I heard about what it was, I was mystified why anyone would want to do it. It's extra work. Like, why would you do that? That's how naive I was.
Now, you said yesterday that a conversation with Ann Lukenbiel was sort of a critical piece
yes.
of this path into the Cornell Law School. Could you?
Sure. So I was, so as I mentioned, my first semester at Cornell, I did very badly. And then immediately I started to do very, very well. And so I thought suddenly again, law school was a real possibility for me. Again, being naive, I took the LSAT. I didn't study for it. They said you have to take this exam in order to get into law school. And I went and took it. And fortunately, I did reasonably well. But I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what my grades meant. I didn't know what my score meant. And so I called over to the law school and said, you know, I'm an undergrad here. Can I come by and talk sometime to someone about who I am and my grades and get some advice? I had gone to my undergraduate academic advisor, who said to me, you should apply to Princeton Law School. And I immediately knew that that was not the person to talk to, since Princeton doesn't have a law school. And I said, let me go over to the law school and there'll be someone there who will really know. And I was fortunate that Ann Lukenbiel found the time to talk to me. And I went into her office, I'll never forget it, and I was nervous. I wasn't really there to ask for anything other than advice. And she said, why don't you apply to the law school? She said, there's this 6-year program that we have where we take a student after their junior year and your grades, look like you might be a viable candidate. Your LSAT score looks like it might make you such. And I said, why would I want to do that? And she says, well, we'll waive the fee. Here's the application. Just work on it over the weekend and bring it back in. And I did. And I got in. And but I again was so naive. And so the program at the time was after your junior year, instead of your senior year as an undergraduate, you would take courses at the law school, would be your first year of law school. Those courses would carry over for to complete your undergraduate degree and be your first year law school. So you were saving a year. And I came back to campus. I was a resident advisor on North Campus. I came back to campus early and law school classes started and I was immediately lost. I was out of my element, academically, socially. They were students with a very different focus. I was walking across campus seeing all my friends playing frisbee and throwing footballs and wanting to join them. And after I don't remember how long it was, it might have been 3 or 4 weeks, I came back to the law school and I said, I can't do this. I really need to defer. People weren't happy about that. I remember talking to Dean Lukenbiel again, and she sort of tried to convince me to stick it out. And I said, I really can't. And then, so I went back, I completed my undergraduate, and then I really still felt like I wasn't ready. So I went to the University of Chicago. I was a dorm geek. And so I went to the University of Chicago and I became their assistant dean of student housing. And I ran most of their undergraduate housing system for a year. And that was a period for me for growth. I was in a new city. I was working. I had sort of those day-to-day expectations. I loved being in Chicago. But what it did for me was fortify my commitment to law school. And so I called back over to the law school and said, I would like to come back. They made me fly in for an interview and talk to me, and understanding, that I had left in the way that I did, to see if I was really serious, and I came back to the law school at that point.
Okay, and then in law school, you had a diversity of experiences.
I loved law school.
Sounds to me as though important experiences included the legal aid clinic.
Yes.
And Faust Rossi. And no doubt others too, but I'd like to have you talk about your experience in the legal aid.
Those two things formed me.
Yeah.
The legal aid clinic was really helpful to me in that as I said, I was very naive about the practice of law, about what law school was about. I was at law school for a couple of weeks before I really understood plaintiff and defendant and appellee and appellant. I didn't understand if you were the plaintiff, how you could be the appellant on the next. I didn't understand. And so there were all of these concepts and terms in civil procedure that I think probably came easier to some, that I was just sort of floating through. The legal aid clinic put all of that in the context for me. It put it in the context of there's a client who has a problem. And these are the mechanisms, either the procedural mechanisms or the legal process in terms of thinking and writing and, sort of laying out their concerns in writing in some way that allowed me to understand what I was learning and trying to do in law school. And so in law school, academically, I was just okay. And I didn't understand it. And I was shaken by that fact because I thought, I'm a reasonably smart guy, but I didn't get it. So the legal aid clinic really put that into context. And the other thing it did was all of the professors there became my friends. Barry Strom became a very close and long-term, 30-year friend of mine, or longer. The other professors in the clinic, including Kathleen Sullivan, became sort of really close to me in terms of shepherding me through the world of law and helping me understand what this was all about. And so for the first time I began, and I started in the clinic.
They were great models too.
Unbelievable lawyers, unbelievable people who understood and determined that they could best use their legal talents and abilities to help disadvantaged people who were in need of help. And so they were great role models to this day with Barry Strom, great role model. And so for the first time, I understood what I was trying to accomplish at law school. I understood how all of this fit into a framework to help people to resolve problems, to use these sort of analytical thought processes to explain or to represent a client. So that was seminal. The other moment that was seminal for me, both of these occurred in my second year. was I had taken evidence with Professor Rossi and liked it, but liked the course largely because of his personality and his teaching style. He was a storyteller. He was engaging. At the end, you understood the rule. You understood why it was in place, and you understood how to think about the rule, all the while being entertained in a way that was a style that I've tried to adopt in my presentations in my career, to tell a story to people, to draw people in with a personal story. He said some things that I remember to this day and always incorporate. You know, we talked about humanizing whoever is your subject. Sometimes the subject of your speech is yourself. How do you humanize yourself? How do you make a connection with your audience? And so I took that, and then I took trial advocacy with him, because I was beginning to think.
Was that taught in the intersession at that time, or was
no? It was a full semester course.
Yeah.
And one day, walking into trial advocacy, we had a series of presentations we had to do, a jury opening statement, and probably, you know, we had done mock cross-examinations during the course of the semester. And one day I was walking into class, and Professor Rossi came up behind me, and he threw his arm around me, and he said, "You know, Steve, I think you can be really good at this." And it was the first time that that concept dawned on me. I had, as I mentioned, I was a very average law student my first year. And it was the first time that the notion that I could actually be good at this really began to take shape. And Faust saying that to me, someone who I idolized, I more than respected him, I idolized him as a professor, and as a sort of legal tactician, a person who understood how to work the process, how to make this process of a trial real and alive and compelling for your client. For him to look at me and say, "I think you have talent, I think that you could be good," was incredible. We then, that semester, at the course ended with a couple of day trial, a mock trial that you would have. And I'd never forget, Mark Solomon was my classmate and my partner in this trial. And we presented our case, and at the end of my closing argument, Professor Rossi looked at me and said, "I think that may have been the best closing argument I've ever heard." And again, for me, that was just a moment of affirmation. That was a moment that, at least in the context of this class and this work, I seemed to be heading on the right track. I spoke to him quite a bit after that. I never had a formal relationship with him. I didn't, work with him in any way other than in these classes. But I would talk to him, and I would always go into him, and I would try to get from him what wisdom he could deliver. He was always so incredibly generous. He was always incredibly complimentary. And it made me go into my third year finally believing I begin to understand how this works, how this comes together, what law school is about. And I began to believe I could actually be good at it. The other thing with Professor Rossi that happened is that I think I must have been out of law school 2 years, and I get a call from him. And he asked me to write a recommendation for him. He was being considered for a National Teaching Award, the Roscoe Pound Award. And he said, I have to have 2 students write recommendations for me. And he asked if I would be one of those. And that, again, was just this amazing moment of affirmation, that a sense that his compliments to me were, in fact, real, that he had, 20 years of 15 years of teaching before that. He could have reached out to any one of dozens of students, and that he thought that I would be a person who could, first of all, that he wanted to write on his behalf. Secondly, that he thought I could write a piece that would be helpful and compelling in this, attempt to be recognized by the Roscoe Pound organization. So I thought, that for me was the greatest affirmation, and really another sense that I was at least headed on the right track. The other thing he said to me that stuck with me, he said, you need to spend the first period of your career just gaining skills, just learning. Don't worry about where it's leading you. Don't worry about what you're going to get out of it. Just learn as much as you can learn. And so for some reason I picked 7 years. I don't know why, but I said my first 7 years I'm just going to try to learn. I'm just going to try to get experience so that I can become the kind of lawyer, a good lawyer like I wanted to be.
All right, and so you conclude law school and you launch yourself into this professional learning period.
Yes.
And as you were noting yesterday, over the career of now close to 30 years, you've held many jobs.
Yes.
And it would be pointless for us to take them up one by one, but as you look back on that accumulating experience, what are the experiences that connect most strongly to the person and the professional you are today?
I think there are two strains. One is public service. Finding a way to use whatever abilities that I have for a greater good has been important to me. Was something my mother drilled into me from the time I was a child, coming at the tail end of what is thought to be the civil rights movement. That was always the notion that you are not only standing on the shoulders of people who have fought and bled and died before you in order for you to have the opportunities that you've had, but also that you then had an obligation to reach back and help put someone on your shoulders so they could move forward. And so public service has always been very important to me. I didn't know who I was when I came out of law school, so I went to a small corporate law firm, had a great experience, and then went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and that was where I found myself. I never thought I would be a prosecutor. I came to law school to be a criminal defense attorney, to represent all of the wrongly accused people that I thought were in this system. And so if you had said to me in law school, you're going to be a prosecutor and like it, we probably would have argued. I would have said, you don't understand me, you don't know who I am, you don't know where I come from, you don't know what I think about those people. And it turned out that when I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office to get skills, someone said to me, in order to be a great trial lawyer, you need to try cases, and the best place to go is the U.S. Attorney's Office. Being again naive, I applied to the Southern District of New York, not recognizing how difficult it was to get into. A series of lucky coincidences came together that got me in there. I won't bore you with them. But then when I got there and began to put together cases and try cases, I found that I was a prosecutor. That role was something that I thought fit me well. And that led sort of indirectly to a series of roles in the government. So I was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. I was later on, after an interim job, I was the Deputy General Counsel of the FBI. Louis Freeh, who was the director at the time, knew me from the U.S. Attorney's Office, so when he became director, he asked my closest friend, Howard Shapiro, to be the general counsel, asked me to be the deputy general counsel. I didn't want to go, which was helpful because it allowed me, even though it wasn't my intention, to sort of be very specific about what I would do when I was there. Again, coming from where I came, it was enough of a shock that I was a prosecutor in some level. The notion that I would work at the FBI was very difficult. And so I talked about what I wanted to do. And at the time, I said terrorism. It was right after the first World Trade Center bombing, where terrorism was becoming a more serious, thoughtful issue, but not like it is today. I said I wanted to hunt spies. And so they said, okay, we'll have the espionage investigations that the FBI does report to the director through you. So you'll sit on top of those investigations to get to guide them and participate in some of them. And then I had some other jobs that the director wanted me to do as his special counsel. And so, you know, I loved that job. I felt like I was making a difference in the life of America, frankly. And Oklahoma City bombing happened. I was actually out of the country on another project, and they called me back and asked the general counsel, Howard Shapiro, and myself to sit in the war room on 12-hour shifts. We were two of the three people. Merrick Garland, who now sits on the D.C. Circuit, was the other person who could sign search warrants during the course of that investigation from the government, sign affidavits for search warrants. And we were helping guide that investigation. An incredible experience. It sort of made me grow up and not be naive about how these things work. But also try to bring and maintain, as always, the rule of law in the room, making sure that we're conscious of what our legal parameters were. Loved that job. My next government job then was to the U.S. Attorney in the District of Connecticut. I was appointed by President Clinton into that role, and again, loved that role. It was my first job as a supervisor of attorneys. I had supervised other people in other roles before that, but never attorneys. And to set the direction for the office, to determine how we were going to use our manpower, what issues were going to be, sort of directed at. I chose that we were going to look at public corruption in Connecticut. And during the time of my tenure as U.S. Attorney, we either investigated, indicted, and/or convicted the governor of Connecticut, the mayor of Waterbury, the mayor of Bridgeport, the treasurer of the state, and other officials. And I felt we played a significant role in helping bring attention and rooting out corruption. And then the last role in the government that I had was as a federal judge. And I was incredibly lucky, fortunate, and honored to do that role. Senator Schumer recommended me to President Bush, who ultimately appointed me as a district judge in the Southern District of New York. And I did that for 7 years. And I loved that job. I thought it was a great use of my abilities. I was constantly learning. The array of work that you have before you, both criminal and civil, and in the widest array of civil work, was amazing. I did patent litigation. I had never worked in the world of patent before. I had bankruptcy matters, bankruptcy appeals from a bankruptcy judge who frankly knew far more about bankruptcy than I did, but I was the first level of appeals of those decisions. To corporate transactions, employment discrimination actions, the full range of financial fraud, and I loved that job. But I left.
Yeah. Now let me also note that in what I'll call the public service strand, there was a period in which you were CEO of a not-for-profit in
Yes.
New Haven.
Yes.
And maybe that figures in this story too?
Yeah, that was...
Is New Haven home? Or
New Haven was home, right?
Yeah.
My wife, Kathleen Sullivan, my professor here, who I later married, ultimately became a professor at Yale Law School. So we moved to New Haven, and I lived there, and that's how I became the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut. After my wife passed away, was right at the end of my term as U.S. Attorney. And so I took a year off to sort of focus on raising my daughter. And then the mayor of New Haven asked me to run this nonprofit that the city had set up because it had been designated a federal empowerment zone by the federal government, which meant that the government was going to give New Haven $10 million a year for 10 years. To use that money for jobs programs, for community building, to sort of help impoverished sections of New Haven build. The program had been in place for a couple of years. The money had not been distributed, so it was piling up, and the federal government was growing concerned that the money was piling up and not going out. And the mayor of New Haven asked me to take over the organization. I thought this is the best job I could ever have. My job was now to find worthy jobs training programs, worthy community programs, and fund them. What could be better? It was by far and away the worst job I've ever had. It involved me in sort of the nasty politics of a community that was not used to working together. And again, I was kind of naive and didn't understand it because, as I said to the alderman, this is not a zero-sum game. There's enough money for everyone. And an alderman said to me, you should understand that I get more credibility from my constituents if I block that other community from getting something than I do if I bring something to them. And so that became, many of these folks who were on my board, it was dispiriting. It was, often in the African American community, we would say things like, the money is controlled by the man or by white people, and they don't understand us. They don't understand our problems. And if only we could get control of that, we would better be able to build our communities and build. And so here was that opportunity. I'm African American, obviously. My entire staff was. We were working with African American community groups. Most of the aldermen that we were working with, or many of the aldermen, I won't say most, many of the aldermen were African American. And the issues of the people in the community were maybe a distant third place in their concern, and it made me crazy. It's the only job I've ever had that I woke up on days and said, I don't want to go to work. And what I decided was, and I sort of began talking to the mayor about this and how to fix this problem. One of the great things about my career was that my career was not New Haven based. And so I didn't mind making enemies there. And so what I told the mayor I was going to do is I was going to train up someone to take my position. And then I was going to fire everyone from our board, fire everyone from our board of advisors. I was going to take the heat for that. I was going to bring on new people, and then I was going to leave. And whether he wanted to ask me to leave or whether I was just going to resign, I would then leave. I would have this great set of people who I knew on the board now of advisors and on the board of the organization, and this new person running it, and they would be able to move forward in a way that would get this done. And that's what I did. And I ended up, and fortunately for me, in the middle of that became this process to become a federal judge. And so it made it look like that was the reason I was leaving as the head of this organization. But it really wasn't. I felt the organization was so dysfunctional that you needed to make dramatic change, but that whoever made that change would become a lightning rod. And so I was willing to take that on and then say, okay, I'm going to go. You know, I understand the organization is well placed to move forward into the future. We have good people in place. My staff, I turned most of them over. We now had really great staff in the organization to sort of administer these funds and vet the, proposals from various organizations. And I did that, and I became a federal judge.
Now, there's a lot of static in the process now of becoming a federal judge. I'm assuming with Schumer putting your name forward and Bush then appointing you, there was not much static over your appointment.
Oh. There was more static than you could imagine. So the way it typically works is the senator from the president's party in the state will make a recommendation to the president about who the federal judges should be. Typically, when both senators are from the opposing party, the president will reach to some other person. In this case, at the time, it was Governor Pataki who was making the recommendations. New York was the only state that had this informal agreement between the senators. At the time, it was Senator Moynihan and Senator D'Amato. And their agreement was that whichever party was not in power would still get to make 1 out of every 4 federal judge recommendations. And that's what they did. And so if it was a Democrat in power, D'Amato would tell Senator Moynihan who his 1 judge recommendation is, and Moynihan would put him up to the president, and vice versa if a Republican were in power. That was continued when Schumer took over. Senator Schumer took over from Senator Moynihan, and they did that. Senator D'Amato leaves, it's now 2 Democrats. President Bush comes in and says, we're not going to do that anymore. We don't do that anywhere else. Naming federal judges is the spoils of the presidency, and I'm going to name the federal judge. And Senator Schumer, being a tenacious sort, decided that he was going to put federal judges on the bench. And so he did a couple of things. One is there's this process that most people, I think, are not aware of called blue sheeting. When there's a federal judge nominee from a state, each senator has to sign a blue sheet saying they can get a congressional hearing. If they don't sign that blue sheet for that nominee, there's a hold. You will never get a hearing. No one will ever really know why. Your name just never comes up for hearing. So one thing I think Senator Schumer did was he started blue sheeting the candidates and said, if you don't consider a candidate that I give you, I'm going to blue sheet all of the nominees that you want to make. And that process starts. And then Senator Schumer's selection committee starts to look for a candidate that they want to present to the White House as a potential federal judge nominee. And they were looking for someone, I think, who could bear the scrutiny that they would come under, who couldn't be sort of denigrated because they were too liberal. And I was living in New Haven. I had been removed from the New York legal community for a dozen years at that point. And I got a phone call from someone saying there's an opening in the Eastern District of New York. Would you be interested? This is after my wife has passed away. And I said, you know, I promised my daughter I would stay in New Haven until she graduates from college. She's only 12. I'm going to stay in New Haven for at least the next 6 years. So thank you. I'm honored. I'm flattered, but I'm not interested. They then called me back a week later and said, there's an opening in the Southern District. And I said, where? And they said, downtown Manhattan. And I said, well, that's only 2 miles away from Brooklyn. It isn't that the Eastern District wasn't good enough for me. I cannot do that, and I won't. I promised my daughter I'll say thank you. And then a week later, they called me and said, there's an opening in the White Plains Courthouse of the Southern District of New York. Getting closer, and you can stay in New Haven and commute, if you're willing to do that commute. And I was then flattered. And so I entered the process, right? And so they looked at me as a candidate, I think, with a really strong law enforcement credentials. I'd been an assistant U.S. attorney, the FBI, the U.S. attorney. And so no one could challenge me on that. I had no other real public record. So it was, you know, I think Senator Schumer thought, I mean, I don't think it was thought that I was like the smartest lawyer they could find in a 3-state radius. I think that they thought I was smart enough. I had good reputation and good work behind me. And I was a person, because of my work at the FBI, I had been background checked in all of my government jobs. I had been polygraphed because I was doing espionage work and terrorism work. I had been polygraphed on a couple of 3 occasions, I believe. So they knew that nothing was going to fly out of my closet in this process. And so they put me forward, and my understanding is Governor Pataki was not happy. And so he then wanted to put forward another candidate for the same slot. And I think a tactical mistake he made is he put up 5 candidates. I think he would have been better off had he chosen the best candidate, and they would have had a clearer choice. I went to the White House to interview with the Deputy White House Counsel. And at that point, I heard that there was no way I was going to get through the process, that they were going to interview me, they were going to say to Senator Schumer they had a better candidate, and that was going to be it. And I decided to go to the interview, and what that did for me is it thoroughly freed me to be comfortable in the interview. And the gentleman who interviewed me, Associate White House Counsel, whose name I cannot remember at this moment, was very different than me. He was a Mormon. He had 14 children, I believe. And we just had the most pleasant conversation. And I was respectful, but loose enough that I made a joke here and there. And at the end of the interview, he looked at me and he said, I'm going to send you through to the next phase of the process, which literally drew gasps from the other people in the room because they knew I was not supposed to get out of this interview. And I looked at him and I said, you know, I knew we would get along because we're so much alike. You're a white man with 14 kids. I'm a black single father with 1. And he laughed and he sends me through. The next phase of the interview, I was interviewed by Judge Gonzalez, who was the White House counsel. And a couple of interesting things happened. One is I was told before the interview by Senator Schumer that the word was they were very concerned about my wife, who has since passed away, and that they had heard she was a communist. And I literally laughed when he said it. Like, are there communists in America today? Like, where do they meet? I don't know who these people are. What does that mean? And Senator Schumer said, no, they seriously are concerned because your wife was in the clinic at Yale, and there are some people who believe that people who work in the clinic are communists. And you knew Kathleen Dean Martin. I idolized my wife probably more than one should. And I said to Senator Schumer, you neither need to tell me not to go, or you need to tell them not to ask me anything, say anything like that to me, because this will turn very ugly very fast. I will not bear that. I don't care if I'm a judge or not. I will not do it. And he says, I'm not going to tell them anything, and I'm not going to tell you not to go. So you're going to show up next Tuesday at the interview at the White House. I said, okay. And so I interviewed with Judge Gonzalez, and there were 4 White House associate or assistant White House counsel in this conference room. Very short conference table. He's sitting just a little further from me than you. And he interviewed me for an hour, and it was both the longest and the shortest hour of my life. He asked me a lot of questions about Supreme Court cases, recent Supreme Court cases. And luckily, I had been teaching a seminar at Yale, and many of the cases he mentioned were part of my course. I was actually thoroughly familiar with them, and he would ask me about different justices, namely mostly Justice Scalia and his positions on these cases, and I would articulate why I would have perhaps approached it a little bit differently than Justice Scalia had. And in my moment of peak, after like 4 or 5 of these questions about Justice Scalia and did I agree, I said to him, you know, you should just assume that I'm going to disagree with everything Justice Scalia says. And if there are other questions that you have for me today, we should go on to those. And he then asked me, after I was U.S. Attorney, I had been interviewed by the Vera Institute, along with a bunch of other U.S. attorneys, former U.S. attorneys. And I had said at that time that I thought I disagreed on moral grounds with the death penalty. And they published this, and I said, I think it's a hole in our collective soul when we do that, and I just don't believe in it. So it's not even, I don't get to the issue of disparate treatment of African Americans versus white defendants in that process. I just don't believe in it. And so they asked me about that, and I sort of talked about that. And then, but I'm waiting all the time for this comment about my wife. And at the very end of the interview, it's now over, and the woman who's sitting immediately to my left, I have a peripheral view of her, and she says, I went to Yale with your wife. And immediately my blood rises, it rushes to my ears. I hear nothing else she says. But I know this is the comment, right, that she's this communist, and finally, as she's finishing, I hear her say, one of the greatest people I've ever known. And now I realize I've missed everything she said, and I look at her and I say, excuse me, what did you say? And she said, you know, how though she was in a very different political place than my wife was, that my wife had convinced her to complete her legal education, had talked to her about ways in which she could use her legal education to sort of be, you know, make a mark in society and to help people and to, you know, sort of move forward in things that she cared about and believed in. And she thought that my wife was one of the sort of seminal figures in her legal career and perhaps the greatest person she had ever known. And after her saying that, Judge Gonzalez says to me, I'm going to recommend you to the president. And he does. And President Bush appoints me as president. I mean, as president, my dream, appoints me as a federal district judge.
Well, we should talk now, perhaps, about your decision to leave that position and to go with a large private firm.
Yeah, you know, I had to do a lot of introspection about my decision to do that, because what it made clear to me is that it spoke fundamentally to something about me. Saying it in a very nice way, I like change. Mm-hmm. I like challenge. Saying it in perhaps a little bit not so nice way, I actually think I can do almost anything. And so if you put a challenge in front of me, I think I can conquer. I mean, I know I can't be a physicist or a brain surgeon, but that if you put something that is at all within the range of my abilities, I actually think I can do it and do it well.
Well, and not only that, but I think maybe you're also saying that you will respond. I mean, that you like a challenge.
I like a challenge. I like the notion of going somewhere and figuring it out. So when the head of global litigation for Skadden came to me, another law firm had come to me a few months before, and I said, thanks, I'm not interested. I'm going to be a federal judge the rest of my life. I love this job other than sentencing people. Didn't love that so much. But I love this job. I feel I'm making a contribution. And when the head of litigation at Skadden came to me, he was very interesting because after I said no initially, he kept coming back. And he took me to another lunch, he took me to dinner, and we began to talk about the possibility of what I might be able to do. And this whole notion of like the challenge of it kicked in for me. It is a world I hadn't explored on that level, sort of being at a big corporate law firm, a well-respected firm. It was one of the 2 or 3 firms that I held in the highest regard. All of them had appeared before me. But I really respected the work of Skadden and thought that they did sort of really high quality work across, sort of like both geographical and subject matter footprint. And so it became intriguing to me. But then I interviewed and I went to Skadden, and they do a session where partners from the New York office and other on the video screen, but get to come in and ask you questions. And I'm in this conference room, and there must be 40 partners in there with me. And they're asking me questions about my career and this change and what would I see my practice as being. And they said, do you have any questions? And I looked at them and I said, tell me about the soul of Skadden. And they looked at me, well, what are you talking about? I said, look, I know high quality legal work and doing great work for your clients is a high priority. I get that. What do you care about separate and apart from that? That's what will matter to me. If I can make this move, it has to be more than I get to represent sort of big corporations and high profile clients. Hopefully I'll get to do that, but there needs to be something more. And Joe Flom, who was alive at the time, right? Skadden, Arp, Slate, Marr, and Flom. Joe Flom, who was the first associate at Skadden and was alive at the time, said to me, let me first talk to you about the Skadden Fellows program. And the Skadden Fellows is an amazing program that Skadden does. Nobody else does anything like it. Every year, and I'm on the board of it now, proudly, every year we take about 30 law school graduates and pay for them to go into the public sector. We pay their salary for 2 years. We pay their health insurance. And if their law schools don't do loan forgiveness, we pay off their student loans. And we just do that so they go across the country in public service organizations and do work. We get no benefit from it. These are not people who come back and work at Skadden. In fact, we've had 677 Skadden Fellows. Only one has ever worked at Skadden, and that's because they needed a bridge job until another job opened. This is a job about people who want to be in the public sector. And it's the way that Skadden looks at the legal universe and says, we're at this level serving big corporate clients. We're incredibly blessed and honored to be doing that. We owe the profession. We have the Skadden Scholars Program, where we take 40 students a year at CCNY who come in, usually from immigrant, disadvantaged backgrounds, who want to go into law, who think that they want to go into law. We subsidize a professor at CCNY to start not subsidize, we pay for a professor to teach them about law and law classes. In the summers, they get to work at Skadden. We just had our first graduating cohort. One got into Yale, one got into Berkeley, one got into NYU, one got into the University of Chicago. These are students that probably as freshmen could never have dreamed of getting into law school. CCNY has never had that kind of success. We do more pro bono than any law firm in the country. We do over 200,000 hours a year. And unlike a lot of firms that push pro bono projects to their first, second, third, fourth year, we do it throughout our firm. So in any given year, 90% of our associates are involved in a pro bono project and 60% of our partners. They came to me after 6 months and said, what's your pro bono project that you're going to do here? And I said, well, I'm on the board of this organization. And they said, no, that's not Skadden pro bono. What is your Skadden pro bono? It is part of the ethos of the firm and who we are. And so this notion that we have an obligation in our great fortune to give back to the legal community in a host of ways became very important. The last thing they said to me is, we want to figure out this diversity issue. They're very concerned, as are many of the firms, it's not Skadden in particular, about diversity in the profession, why it is that diverse candidates are not making it through the ranks to partnership. At Skadden, I'm one of 7 African-American partners. At Skadden, we have about 26% female partnership. Why are those numbers where they are? And they said, we want you to focus a lot of your time and energy on that. In my chutzpah, I thought, oh, I'll figure that problem out. That's an easy one. I'm now 3 years in and I don't have answers. It's a complicated problem. Some of the problem clearly rests with law firms. Some of the solution, I think, is with corporations and what demands they make on us. Because as I wrote a piece that was published about this issue, I said, if a general counsel said to any partner at any firm, you must have diverse people working on my project, and I'm going to meet with them. I'm going to meet with them, I'm going to have lunch, and we're going to talk about what they actually did on the project and what kind of guidance they're getting, what kind of help they're getting. that will move me as a partner in my law firm to make sure that I have a diverse team, to make sure that they are involved in some meaningful way in the project, that they have a 360-degree view of the project. So when they have this discussion, it's real. Yeah. I think that there are issues going all the way back to law school that I'm sort of beginning to try to think through. But that was very enticing to me because, again, I believe I'm supposed to help people. I'm supposed to bring people along. And so when Skadden said to me, we really want you to think about those issues, I said, that's something I really want to attack. I really thought I would have figured most of it out by now, and I haven't. And I've spoken to a lot. I was chair of the City Bar Committee on Diversity. So I've talked to across a broad range of, high-end, top-flight, big law firms, medium-sized law firms, individuals, consultants who consult in this area. And there are a lot of pieces to an answer. We haven't figured it out yet. We need to. I think that the profession is better when it is more diverse, when you bring other perspectives and experiences to the table to sort of help you think through some nettlesome, complicated problems that your clients have. And we haven't figured that out. So it was those things. It was this notion of this place has a soul, separate and apart from we do great work for our clients, that made me say, I'll give that a try. I've always been of the opinion that if it doesn't work, I'll try something else. If after 2 years, if after 3 years, I'm not happy, it isn't fulfilling whatever needs I have, I'll find something else and I'll do something else. I've been lucky because a lot of things have come along and people have come forward. But I'm actually surprisingly, maybe this is faint praise, surprisingly happy at Skadden. I really respect the lawyers there. And these other issues keep my mind occupied. So I'll just tell you very briefly, one of the things that I've started to do since I moved back into New York City 4 months ago now, is every other Friday I have a dinner at my house where I invite probably anywhere from 6 to 8 or 9 associates. And so we'll have a cocktail party section where I'll have some other partner from my firm come in, and just for people to be able to begin to forge relationships and build communication. And then I get them out and I sit the associates down in my table. I love cooking and I've taken a lot of cooking classes. I usually will cook for them. They will drink my wine, and then we will sit down and talk about the practice of law. Both big picture things they ought to understand, and then issues about the way Skadden operates that they ought to understand and how they ought to behave within that. And so that's one way that I've said I'm going to try to touch people individually, not only diverse associates, but particularly focusing on diverse associates and women. I want to make sure that they understand what's going on. That's not enough. That's not the answer. That's a little something I can do while I try to find the answer.
Well, you're still a young man, and so there may be some other challenge that gets thrown your way one of these days, but it sounds as though at the moment you're sufficiently challenged.
I am challenged.
Where you are.
I am challenged. I'm fulfilled. Let me just take a moment also, we haven't talked about this enough, how important and how much I love Cornell Law School. Right. The law school was a period for me that helped me grow into a young man, at least if not a man. It helped me understand the ways in which I was brash. It helped me understand my deficiencies. And it did that in an environment where I always felt supported. Even at times when there was friction, I always felt fundamentally I was happy to be here. I was honored to be here. I think it had my classmates were always uniformly wonderful. And I think it had a lot to do with the size of the school. I think it had a lot to do with the tone that the faculty set. We weren't perfect. We were still struggling with issues, but we were working on them together. That there was this sense of camaraderie, not only among me and my classmates, but among professors, and I connected with a few. Some of my classmates connected with others, and depending on personality and interest and circumstance, you might find that connection. But it was a place that really allowed you to do that. The students themselves, we were a fledgling African-American Balsa group. And my class, I think, was 9 African-Americans, which was the largest class Cornell had ever had at that time. And there was an incredible camaraderie there. And so, I felt like this was a place that allowed me to grow up. that gave me a safe atmosphere to do that in, allowed me to make mistakes, allowed me to make mistakes academically, allowed me to make mistakes socially, and to grow from that. And it's one of the reasons why I have always tried to stay connected to the law school. I've always given money. Even when I didn't have money, I'd give $100 or a couple of $100s a year. Now that I'm at Skadden, I can give a little bit more, and I have. And, you know, fortunately, Dean Schwab has asked me to be on his Dean's Advisory Committee for quite some time. And I loved feeling that connection because this was such an important place for me. It was a place, it was a place for me because it was actually out of the mainstream of commerce. We weren't in New York or one of the large cities, and it allowed us as a group to really focus our energies around legal education and not what else is going on around. Though you're aware of what's going on, you're still a citizen of the world. And so I've always just been incredibly grateful. So anytime I've been asked to come back and talk to students or participate in some way or in the Dean's Advisory Committee, I've really tried to always arrange my schedule to do that, because it was and remains an amazing place. And to look at it, you know, as great as it was when I was here in the early 80s and graduating in 1984, to look at it today and to see how vibrant it is, to see the students, to see the faculty with that same level of engagement, both on the academic side and on, you know, and in writing, and then on the student engagement side, it just makes me proud. And, you know, though I'm not one of those people that get into arguments with people about, is my law school better than yours? The reality is I think it is. And that's not to say there aren't wonderful law students from wonderful law schools out there, but there's nothing that quite pulls it together, in my view, like Cornell does. I mentioned my wife taught at Yale, an amazing law school. I have taught at Yale, I've taught at NYU, I've taught at New York Law School, I've taught at Cardozo as adjunct professors, and no one, in my view, gets it quite like Cornell. We're still struggling to get it perfect. And that's part of the beauty of this community, is we don't sit back and say
and the environment keeps changing.
And
I mean, so that to contrast today with when you were a student, the international dimension has just exploded here at the school.
And to be able to embrace that in a real way, but also not to be so big that students lose the ability to connect with each other, that they lose the ability to connect with the faculty if they choose to. One of the things I like to talk to students about is trying to find a moment that you can start that interaction where you develop a relationship with a faculty member. And Cornell is a place that gives you the opportunity to do that, and the faculty are open to that. And so I'm just, you know, I'm the largest fan of Cornell. I know there are challenges, and we're in Ithaca, so we're not in the city, and though I think that has its distinct advantages, it has distinct disadvantages in terms of attracting faculty, in terms of attracting students, in terms of all of those kinds of things. But I think that when you choose to come to Cornell, and if you choose to engage the community at the law school, it will be the most fulfilling, you know, sort of academic engagement you can have. And it prepares you to go out there and become a private investigator, to become the U.S. attorney, become an assistant U.S. attorney, be a federal judge, to do any of those things. If you're willing to continue to learn and apply the, you know, the groundwork and the foundation that you've been given here, there's no place like it. And so, you know, one of the things, one of my closest friends is a graduate of Yale, and he sort of talks to me about, you know, sort of how brilliant everyone is who goes to Yale. And to be coarse for just a moment, one of the things I always say to him is, I've just made a career of kicking the butt of people from Yale. And that's because I went to Cornell.
And you have so much to give back.
Thank you. I try, and I want to continue.
Anything we haven't touched on?
No. You know, this has, you know, been, and for me also, thank you for asking me. I was honored to even be asked to be included in this project.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.